NBC General Hospital spoilers reveal that when Willow stepped into Drew's Senate seat, the applause in Washington sounded like redemption. Cameras framed her as resilient, dignified, destined. But in Port Charles, redemption carried a pulse of dread. Because Drew was still alive, immobile, silent, suspended between awareness and oblivion, and his condition required maintenance every single day. Willow's confession to Nina did not come wrapped in tears. It arrived with precision. She explained the shooting, the calculated second act, the injection that left Drew trapped in a body that would not respond. She described it not as cruelty, but as necessity. Drew had been a threat to her children, to her future, to her stability. Now he was contained. The only danger left was recovery. One missed dose, one mistake, and he could regain speech. And if he spoke, everything would collapse: her career, her freedom, her life. Washington demanded her presence. Hearings, interviews, strategy sessions. Sidwell's pressure made absence impossible. Willow could not be physically tethered to Port Charles anymore. That left a single solution: Nina. The request was simple in wording, catastrophic in implication. Nina would administer the daily injections. She would ensure Drew remained exactly as he was: paralyzed, voiceless, neutralized. Willow did not threaten her outright, but the emotional leverage was unmistakable. Their fragile reconciliation, Nina's access to Wiley and Amelia, the restored bond she had fought so hard to earn, everything now hinged on loyalty. Saying yes felt less like agreement and more like surrender. The first time Nina stood beside Drew's bed with a syringe, the air felt thinner. His eyes moved slightly enough to suggest awareness. That flicker unsettled her. Was he conscious inside that prison? Did he understand? Nina forced herself not to hesitate. She told herself he deserved no mercy. He had hurt Willow. He had destabilized her. This was protection. But protection has a cost. Each injection rewrote something inside Nina. The act became routine, measured dosage. Steady hand, quiet disposal. Routine dulled horror into process. The shock of the first day faded. By the 10th, her hands no longer trembled. That frightened her more than guilt ever could. Meanwhile, Willow transformed in Washington. Her voice grew sharper, her posture more composed. Speeches about integrity and responsibility filled television screens while Nina's reality shrank to a single daily ritual. Their phone calls shifted from emotional connection to logistical coordination, dosage times, travel schedules, risk management. The distance between DC and Port Charles became psychological as much as physical. Nina began to feel the split in herself. On one side, the mother who had always acted impulsively out of love. On the other, a woman capable of sustained conspiracy. She rationalized constantly. Mothers have done worse. Survival in Port Charles has never been clean. Willow's future mattered more than Drew's autonomy. But at night, doubt crept in. She imagined Drew regaining speech mid-injection. She imagined investigators tracing inconsistencies in his medical records. She imagined headlines destroying Willow overnight. Fear coiled around her thoughts, yet when morning came, she performed the task again. The most destabilizing part was not fear of exposure. It was the subtle sense of control. Drew, once charismatic and untouchable, now depended entirely on Nina's compliance. His fate rested in her hand every day. That power created a disturbing undercurrent of satisfaction. She would never admit it, but part of her relished the reversal. And that realization marked the true beginning of the madness. Because this was no longer solely about protecting Willow. It was about control, about deciding who remained powerful and who did not. Nina had crossed from reluctant accomplice into active guardian of captivity. Willow, for her part, showed no visible cracks. She moved through Washington with calculated confidence. If she felt guilt, she buried it well. Nina started to wonder whether her daughter fully understood what she had become, or whether ambition had simply overridden remorse. One evening, as Nina prepared the injection, Drew's gaze fixed on her longer than usual. No blink, no flicker, just stillness charged with something that felt almost conscious. For a moment, Nina's hand hovered. If he recovered, this nightmare would end, but so would Willow's career. So would their fragile stability. She injected him. Driving home afterward, she recognized a shift inside herself. The line had not merely been crossed, it had vanished. What once felt unthinkable now felt procedural, necessary. The madness was not loud. It did not explode in dramatic confession. It settled quietly, adjusting her moral compass degree by degree until North no longer existed. Willow's star continued to rise in Washington. Port Charles remained blissfully unaware, and Nina lived in the space between applause and silence, administering loyalty one measured dose at a time. The most terrifying truth was not that she might be caught. It was that she had begun to accept this as normal. Love had transformed into complicity. Protection had become imprisonment. And as long as Willow held power, as long as Drew lay silent, Nina would continue steady hand, measured breath, convincing herself that this was what motherhood required. Willow did not soften the truth when she spoke to Nina. There was no trembling vulnerability, no desperate plea for understanding. She laid everything out with unsettling clarity, as if she were presenting a strategy rather than confessing a crime. She reminded Nina calmly, deliberately, that she had already given her countless chances to prove herself worthy of being part of her life. Too many chances, perhaps. And this, she implied without raising her voice, was the last one. If Nina miscalculated the dosage, if she hesitated, if she even entertained the thought of telling someone what Willow had done to Drew, that would be the breaking point. There would be no forgiveness left to offer. The message was unmistakable. This was not simply a request for help. It was a conditional alliance. Willow understood Nina's deepest vulnerability, her longing to be close to Wiley and Amelia, to reclaim some fragment of the motherhood she had lost. Access to the children was not just a privilege, it was Nina's emotional oxygen. Willow knew that, and in her measured, almost chilling honesty, she made it clear that continued access depended on compliance. If Nina wanted to remain in her grandchildren's lives, if she wanted the fragile reconciliation between mother and daughter to survive, then she would do exactly what was asked of her. No questions. No mistakes. For Nina, the conversation felt like stepping into a psychological labyrinth. She had always craved this closeness with Willow, always chased the chance to rebuild what had been broken. Now that opportunity stood in front of her, but it came wrapped in moral compromise. The very bond she longed to restore required her to cross a line she once believed she would never approach. Yet, the pull was irresistible. Willow made it clear she had no one else she could confide in. She could not tell Sidwell. His political instincts would turn the situation into leverage or liability. She could not risk exposing the truth to anyone in Washington. In Port Charles, her only other confidant was Liz, who believed Willow to be a devoted wife, even saintly for stepping away from her hospital career to care for Drew. Liz saw sacrifice. She saw loyalty. She saw compassion. Telling her the truth would shatter that illusion and possibly destroy everything. That left Nina. The weight of being the sole keeper of this secret altered Nina in ways she did not anticipate. At first, it felt like validation. Willow trusted her. Willow needed her. After years of estrangement, accusation, and fractured loyalty, this was proof that their connection mattered. Nina convinced herself that this was intimacy of the deepest kind, a shared secret binding them together. But intimacy built on silence has a dangerous edge. Each time Willow spoke about maintaining Drew's condition, her tone carried a clinical detachment that unsettled Nina. This was no longer about anger or revenge. It was about control, stability, preservation of power. And Nina began to sense that she was not merely protecting her daughter, she was enabling something darker to solidify. Still, the longing to be needed overpowered hesitation. Nina's desire to reconnect with Willow had always bordered on obsession. She had spent years trying to reclaim lost time, to rewrite history, to prove she was worthy of forgiveness. Now, Willow was offering her a role, an essential one. The injections were not just medical acts, they were rituals of loyalty, proof that Nina would choose her daughter above all else. And that realization triggered a subtle shift inside her. What began as reluctant compliance slowly morphed into a distorted sense of purpose. Nina started structuring her days around the task, timing the visits, monitoring Drew's stillness, reporting back to Willow with quiet efficiency. The secret gave her proximity to her daughter in a way nothing else could. They were partners now, bound by something unbreakable and unspeakable. Yet beneath that connection simmered an unsettling awareness. Willow was no longer the fragile young woman seeking reassurance. She was composed, strategic, willing to leverage emotional bonds for security. And Nina, desperate to maintain closeness, allowed herself to be maneuvered. The more Nina leaned into this role, the more she felt a shift in her own moral compass. She justified each action as maternal devotion. She told herself she was protecting Willow's future, ensuring her stability, safeguarding her grandchildren's lives from chaos. But in quieter moments, she recognized the transformation. Love had begun to blur into fixation, protection into possession. There was a new intensity in Nina's attachment to Willow, an urgency that bordered on mania. She watched her daughters rise in Washington with fierce pride, but also with fear. If Willow no longer needed her, what would remain of their connection? The injections became symbolic, As long as Drew remained silent, as long as Nina remained essential, the bond endured. This is where the madness truly began, not in the act itself, but in the emotional dependency it fostered. Nina's obsession was no longer solely about redemption. It was about preservation. She needed Willow to need her. She needed this shared darkness to anchor their relationship. And that need twisted her perception. Instead of seeing the danger, she began to see inevitability. Instead of questioning Willow's choices, she rationalized them as necessary evolutions. Willow had drawn the boundary clearly: loyalty or exile. Nina chose loyalty. And in doing so, she stepped fully into a new psychological reality, one where secrecy defined intimacy, where silence equaled love, and where the fear of losing her daughter outweighed every ethical hesitation. The reconnection she had longed for was finally within reach, but it came at the cost of becoming someone she barely recognized. What disturbed Nina most was not the threat of exposure. It was the realization that she would likely make the same choice again. Because for Nina, the idea of losing Willow once more was unthinkable. And that, more than anything else, proved how deeply this new obsession had taken root. The risk had always existed, but now it felt dangerously close. Drew could wake up at any moment, even while Nina or Willow was injecting him. What began as a calculated system to maintain control was slowly becoming unstable. The human body does not obey ambition forever. Tolerance shifts, chemistry reacts unpredictably, and even the most precise dosage can fail. Recently, there had been subtle signs, longer blinks, faint finger twitches, a change in breathing rhythm that Nina initially dismissed but later could not forget. When she mentioned it to Willow, the silence on the other end of the call was heavy. Willow's voice, when it returned, was colder, sharper. Adjust the timing. Monitor him more closely. Do not miss a dose. It was no longer maintenance, it was escalation. Willow's anxiety was growing, even as her public composure in Washington remained flawless. Every speech about integrity, every committee appearance, felt like a fragile performance built on a secret that could implode at any second. If Drew regained consciousness, if he spoke even a single coherent sentence, everything would collapse: her career, her freedom, her future. The tension was pushing her further into calculation. She began researching neurological rebound, dosage thresholds, recovery patterns. She smiled at cameras while privately recalibrating risk scenarios. Meanwhile, Nina felt the pressure tightening around her own throat. She was physically present. She administered the injections. If something went wrong, an overdose, an underdose, a visible reaction, medical scrutiny would follow, and that scrutiny would lead directly to her. In trying to protect Willow, she had placed herself in the most exposed position. The irony was brutal. One miscalculation from Nina could send Willow to prison. If Drew woke mid-injection, if his eyes sharpened or his voice cracked through paralysis while Nina stood there holding the syringe, there would be no explaining it away. Doctors would examine his blood work. Toxicology reports would expose interference. Investigators would trace the pattern. Nina's loyalty would become evidence. And under pressure, would she hold firm? That question began to haunt Willow as well. The trust between them shifted subtly. Willow's instructions became more rigid, her tone less emotional and more commanding. Nina started to feel less like a partner and more like a potential liability. The closer Drew came to possible recovery, the more fragile the balance became. Each injection was no longer simply preserving silence. It was a gamble against exposure. Nina imagined the worst. Drew suddenly inhaling sharply, fingers curling around her wrist, a fractured word escaping his lips. She imagined the police arriving, imagined headlines branding Willow a criminal mastermind, and herself the enabling mother who crossed every line for love. The psychological strain intensified with each passing day. Willow's tension manifested as control, tighter schedules, stricter dosage oversight, contingency planning that bordered on paranoia. She had built her political rise on composure, but beneath it she was unraveling. If Drew stirred again, would she escalate further, increase the dosage, consider a more permanent solution? The thought hovered unspoken between them. For Nina, the fear took a different shape. What if she became the weak link? What if panic forced her to confess? What if guilt overwhelmed her at the exact moment investigators pressed hardest? The possibility that she could unintentionally push Willow into prison terrified her more than the crime itself. The tragedy was no longer just what they had done. It was the inevitability of collapse embedded in their strategy. The more Willow tightened control, the more unstable the system became. Biology does not submit forever. If Drew woke up suddenly, the shock would ripple beyond Port Charles. Washington would turn ruthless. Sidwell would distance himself instantly. The image of the devoted wife-turned-senator would shatter overnight, and at the center of the fallout would stand Nina, syringe in hand, caught between maternal devotion and criminal complicity. The most devastating possibility was not merely that Drew would speak. It was that in the moment of crisis, Nina, overwhelmed by fear, guilt, or a single fatal mistake, could become the catalyst that sends Willow to prison. And once that domino falls, no calculation, no political power, no emotional manipulation will be able to stop the chain reaction that follows.